Florida is going through one of the strangest housing resets in America right now. And if you are thinking about moving there in 2026, there are some cities I would be very careful with. Because on the surface, Florida still looks like the dream. No state income tax, warm weather, beaches, palm trees, new construction. People from New York, New Jersey, Illinois, California, and Canada still looking at Florida like it is the escape hatch. But when you get underneath the surface, the math has changed. The old Florida story was simple. You moved south. You got more house for less money. You paid lower taxes. You got better weather. And your home value probably went up because millions of other people wanted the same thing. But that is not the Florida housing market we are looking at today. Today, Florida has some of the highest insurance pressure in the country. Inventory has exploded in several metros. Condo owners are getting hit with assessments and reserve requirements. Some sellers are taking losses from the 2021 and 2022 peak. And in several coastal markets, the monthly payment is no longer just the mortgage. It is the mortgage, the insurance, the flood policy, the HOA, the special assessment, the property tax, the maintenance, and the risk that the next storm changes the value of the property overnight. So in this video, I want to go through 10 Florida cities I would be extremely cautious about in 2026. And then at the end, I will give you 3 Florida cities that I think are actually worth considering if you are still determined to move to the state. Now, I want to be very clear. I am not saying every house in these cities is a bad buy. I am not saying nobody should ever live there. There are always neighborhoods, price points, and personal situations where a city can make sense. But if you are moving to Florida from out of state, and you are buying based on the old pandemic story, these are the places where I think you need to slow down. And the reason I am framing it that way is because Florida has become a market where the city name alone does not tell you enough anymore. One street can be fine. The next street can be in a flood zone. One condo building can be well run. The building across the road can be sitting on a huge assessment. One seller can be unrealistic. Another seller can be desperate. That is why the ranking is not about hating a city. It is about identifying where the downside risk is big enough that you need to negotiate harder or walk away faster. The first city to be very careful with is Miami. Miami is still one of the most desirable cities in America. That is exactly the problem. Because Miami is not just expensive by Florida standards anymore. It is expensive by national standards. You have high home prices, high rents, high insurance, high condo fees, high parking costs, and a cost of living that no longer matches the average local wage. The issue with Miami is that it is supported by a lot of outside money. International buyers, Northeast buyers, high-income remote workers, investors, people who are not necessarily earning Miami wages. That can keep prices elevated for a long time. But it also means the average local buyer is in a very difficult position. If you are making a normal Florida income, Miami can feel almost impossible. And when you add insurance, flood risk, and condo costs, the number gets worse. So Miami is not necessarily a place I would call a crash market. It is worse than that for some buyers. It is a market where the price might not fall enough to make the payment reasonable. That is a dangerous combination. The second city I would be careful with is Miami Beach. Miami Beach is one of those places where the postcard and the spreadsheet tell 2 very different stories. The postcard says ocean, nightlife, walkability, luxury, and status. The spreadsheet says old buildings, flood exposure, expensive insurance, expensive maintenance, and a condo market where the buyer needs to understand every line of the association budget. This is especially important after the Florida condo law changes and reserve pressure that followed the Surfside tragedy. A condo that looks affordable on the listing page can become very expensive once you look at the monthly fee, the insurance structure, and the potential assessment risk. And Miami Beach has another problem. It is not just buying a property, it is buying into a building. If the building has deferred maintenance, low reserves, insurance issues, or a board that has delayed hard decisions, that risk can land on the owner. So if you are looking at Miami Beach in 2026, do not just ask what the unit costs. Ask what the building costs, because that is where the surprise can be. The third city is Fort Lauderdale. Fort Lauderdale has become a more expensive version of itself. For years, people looked at it as the more practical alternative to Miami. Still coastal, still South Florida, still connected to jobs and airports, but a little more manageable. That argument is getting weaker. Fort Lauderdale has high insurance exposure, expensive coastal neighborhoods, flood concerns, and a housing market that has already absorbed a massive run-up in prices. It also sits in Broward County, where insurance and property costs can be very hard on buyers. The risk in Fort Lauderdale is not that nobody wants to live there. People absolutely want to live there. The risk is that the total monthly cost gets so high that the next buyer pool becomes smaller. And when the buyer pool shrinks, sellers have to compete. That is when price cuts show up. The fourth city is West Palm Beach. West Palm Beach has had a huge reputation upgrade in the last few years. Wall Street money moved into Palm Beach County. Companies opened offices. Wealthy buyers came in, and the area started getting talked about like a South Florida finance hub. But for normal buyers, that success created a problem. Prices moved up, rents moved up, insurance moved up, and the affordability story got worse. West Palm Beach is not as extreme as Palm Beach Island, but it is still tied to one of the most expensive coastal counties in Florida. And when a market is being pushed by high-income migration and prestige, regular households can get squeezed. If you are buying there because you have a very specific job, family, or lifestyle reason, fine. But if you are moving there because you think it is still affordable Florida, I would be very careful. The fifth city is Naples. Naples is beautiful. It is also one of the clearest examples of Florida becoming unaffordable for the people who actually keep the city running. Naples has luxury demand, retiree demand, second home demand, and limited coastal supply. That can keep high-end prices supported. But it also creates a market that is very disconnected from local incomes. And Naples sits in a region where insurance and storm risk matter. The homes are expensive. The carrying costs are expensive. The service economy depends on workers who often cannot afford to live close to the jobs. That is not a healthy long-term affordability setup. If you are wealthy and buying in cash, Naples might be fine. But if you are stretching to get in, especially with a mortgage, I would be very careful. The sixth city is Cape Coral. Cape Coral is probably one of the most important housing markets in America to watch. Because Cape Coral tells the story of what happens when a pandemic boom market runs into too much supply, too much insurance pressure, and too many sellers trying to exit at the same time. During the boom, Cape Coral looked like a winner. Waterfront homes, new construction, remote workers, retirees, investors. People wanted Southwest Florida. Then the market changed. Inventory jumped. Insurance became a much bigger issue. The cost to own went up, and home values started coming down from the peak. This is the type of market where buyers can get deals. But getting a deal is not the same thing as buying a safe asset. You need to know why the seller is cutting. You need to know the flood zone. You need to know the roof age. You need to know the insurance quote before you fall in love with the kitchen. Cape Coral is not automatically a bad place to buy, but it is absolutely a place where you do not buy blind. The seventh city is Fort Myers. Fort Myers has a similar issue to Cape Coral, but with a slightly different profile. It has more traditional city infrastructure, more jobs, more apartments, more of a regional economy. But it is still part of the same Southwest Florida story. The region saw a massive run-up. Then it dealt with storm damage, insurance pressure, and inventory growth. And now the buyer has more negotiating power than they had a few years ago. That sounds good. And in some cases, it is good. But Fort Myers is a market where the headline price can fool you. A home might be cheaper than it was in 2022, but the monthly payment can still be ugly because the insurance, taxes, and maintenance are higher. That is why I would not look at Fort Myers through price alone. I would look at the full carrying cost, because the carrying cost is what decides whether the property is actually affordable. The eighth city is Punta Gorda. Punta Gorda is one of those markets that can look calm from the outside and risky from the inside. It is smaller. It is quieter. It has a retirement appeal. It has waterfront appeal, but it also has serious exposure to the same Gulf Coast problems. Storm risk, insurance cost, aging homes, and a housing market that has already seen price weakness. When a smaller market corrects, it can be harder to exit. That is the part buyers forget. In Miami, there is always some buyer somewhere. In smaller retirement-heavy markets, liquidity can dry up faster when sentiment turns. If rates stay high, insurance stays high, and retirees become more cautious, Punta Gorda can sit longer than people expect. So for me, this is a market where you need a very large margin of safety. If you are not getting a real discount, I would not chase it. The ninth city is Northport. Northport is interesting because it was supposed to be the affordable alternative. People priced out of Sarasota looked inland. People priced out of the coast looked for more house. Builders saw demand. Buyers saw relative affordability. And then the market got crowded. Northport is tied into the Northport-Sarasota-Bradenton Metro, which has seen inventory pressure and price weakness. The problem here is that buyers often move inland, thinking they are escaping the expensive part of Florida, but they still inherit a lot of the same Florida cost structure. Insurance is still a factor. Heat is still a factor. Car dependency is still a factor. HOAs can still be a factor. And if you are commuting towards Sarasota, traffic becomes a real cost too. Northport might work if the price is right, but I would not treat it like a guaranteed bargain just because it is cheaper than Sarasota. The 10th city is Tampa. And I know some people are not going to like this one, because Tampa is still one of the strongest job markets in Florida. It has healthcare. It has finance. It has logistics. It has a real economy. It has culture, sports, restaurants, universities, and a younger population than many coastal retirement markets. But that is exactly why the risk is more complicated. Tampa is not a dead market. It is a market that got very expensive very quickly. And when a good city gets overpriced, the correction can be slower and more confusing. Tampa Bay also has flood and storm exposure, especially in low-lying areas and parts of Pinellas. Insurance is a factor. Traffic is a factor. And the price-to-income ratio is still stretched for many local buyers. So I am not saying Tampa is a terrible place. I am saying Tampa is a place where you need to be very selective. Buying the wrong house, in the wrong flood zone, at the wrong price, with the wrong insurance, quote, can turn a good city into a bad investment. Now, those are the 10 Florida cities I would be most careful with. Miami, Miami Beach, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, Naples, Cape Coral, Fort Myers, Punta Gorda, North Port, and Tampa. The common theme is not that these places are worthless. The common theme is that the old Florida bargain is gone in many of them. And if you buy without understanding insurance, flood risk, HOA risk, inventory, and local wages, you can get trapped in a property that looks good on Zillow, but feels terrible in real life. Now, let me give you 3 Florida cities that I think are actually worth considering. The first is Jacksonville. Jacksonville is not perfect. It has crime issues in some neighborhoods. It has sprawl. It has parts of the city that are not attractive to every buyer. But from a real estate standpoint, Jacksonville has something many Florida cities do not have anymore. It still has a more reasonable price structure. It has a real job base. It has a major port. It has healthcare, logistics, military, finance, and corporate employers. It has beaches, but it is not priced like Miami Beach. And compared to South Florida and the Gulf luxury markets, the insurance burden can be more manageable depending on the property. Jacksonville also gives buyers more room to negotiate because inventory has improved. That is what I like. I do not want a city where buyers have no leverage. I want a city where the economy is real, but the seller still has to compete. Jacksonville gives you that better balance. The second city worth considering is Gainesville. Gainesville is not a flashy Florida city, and that is part of the point. It is inland. It is anchored by the University of Florida and a major healthcare system. It has a younger population. It has less dependence on beach tourism and luxury migration. And it has a different kind of stability than a lot of Florida markets. University towns are not immune from housing corrections, but they often have a more durable demand base. Students, faculty, healthcare workers, researchers, government employees, people who are there because the local economy requires them to be there, not just because the weather is nice. That matters. Gainesville is also not dealing with the same direct coastal risk as Miami Beach, Naples, Cape Coral, or Fort Lauderdale. You still need to check insurance. You still need to check neighborhoods. But the overall risk profile is different. If I were looking for a Florida city that is less speculative and more practical, Gainesville would be on the list. The third city worth considering is Tallahassee. Tallahassee does not get talked about like Miami, Tampa, Orlando, or Naples. But from an affordability and stability standpoint, that can be a good thing. It is the state capital. It has Florida State University. It has Florida A&M. It has government employment, education, healthcare, and a housing market that is not as distorted by coastal luxury demand. It is not for everyone. It is not a beach city. It is not a nightlife city on the level of Miami. It is not the place you move if your dream is a waterfront condo and a boat slip. But if your goal is to live in Florida without paying South Florida prices, Tallahassee deserves a look. The key advantage is that it is more connected to local incomes. That is what I keep coming back to. The best Florida city is not the city with the prettiest drone footage. It is the city where the math still works. Because in 2026, Florida is no longer a simple move. You cannot just say, it is Florida, so it will go up. You cannot just say, there is no state income tax, so it is cheap. You cannot just say, people will always move there. The data is more complicated now. Migration has slowed from the pandemic peak. Inventory has risen. Insurance is still one of the biggest problems in the country. And buyers are finally starting to push back. That is not bad news if you are patient. It is actually good news, because the old market gave buyers no leverage. The new market gives buyers leverage, but only if they know where to look. If you are buying in Miami, Miami Beach, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, Naples, Cape Coral, Fort Myers, Punta Gorda, North Port, or Tampa, I would demand a discount. I would get the insurance quote before making the offer. I would check the flood zone. I would read the HOA documents. I would look at the roof age. I would check days on market. I would ask how many price cuts the seller has already made. And I would not let the Florida dream override the Florida math. Because that is where people get hurt. They buy the story. They ignore the spreadsheet. Then 6 months later, the insurance renewal shows up, the HOA fee jumps, the seller down the street cuts by $50,000, and suddenly the dream feels a lot more expensive. Florida can still be a great place to live, but in 2026, it is not a place where every city deserves your money. Some cities are still worth considering. Some are only worth buying at a major discount. And some, if you do not have a very specific reason to be there, I would avoid altogether.